Chapter 37. The Only Thing. Sky stood at the edge of the rock above Jessie and Tony, her hands covering her mouth. Frankie was still too far away to get to Jessie in time. Sky couldn't stand there and watch as this monster beat her boy. Her gaze flicked from the edge of the rock she stood on to Tony. She did the only thing she could do. Sky dove off the mountain ledge straight for Tony. Tony wasn't as large of a target as Pete would have been, but he was big enough. Branches and twigs left deep welts, and an icy fear raced through her. The drop felt longer than Sky imagined. She crashed into Tony and gasped. Her stomach rolled as she grabbed at the flailing Tony. Sky coiled her arms and legs around Tony's neck and body. He would not shake her off. Tony jerked away from the slope, ripping grass and branches as he struggled to hang on. Once Tony found a hold for one hand, he pummeled Sky's legs which were wrapped around his middle. She tightened the arm around his neck, restricting his air. Tony gasped and grabbed Sky's arm. His iron fingers dug into her flesh as he forced her to let go. But before he could, he lost his grip on the mountain and plunged downward, taking Sky with him. Together, they rolled over bushes and scraped against stones until Sky pushed away from him. There was a crunching thud when Tony hit the trunk of a large tree. After that, he limply bounced once before continuing the fall. When Tony hit bottom, he was still. A low whine escaped Sky as the ground rushed toward her. She slammed onto the dirt only seconds after Tony. Stunned and gasping, Sky lay there beside the unconscious man. The treetops did a crazy dance in her rattled mind. Did I hit my head? I think I may have a concussion. The words were the only calm in her swirling head. After the turmoil, the world suddenly seemed quiet and peaceful. As if it were a slow Sunday afternoon and she had chosen to rest here. Sky heard the wind blow gently through the trees and watched them stir. She listened to the birds calling out to one another as they flew overhead. Then Jessie screamed. Shaken and with little rational thought, Sky struggled to her feet. He needs me. She ignored the pain and the strange slide of her body. It never occurred to Sky he screamed over concern for her. Sky looked up. A dirt cloud followed Jessie as he half ran, half scraped his way down the side of the mountain. Sky tried to speak, to warn him to slow down. But when she opened her mouth, nothing came out. Jessie neatly hit bottom with both feet, as though he were getting off a slide. He rushed to her. With care, Jessie led her away from Tony. Limping, she followed, confused over the tears and fear covering Jessie's face as he glanced up at her. Sky groaned in pain when she put a hand to Jessie's face. I'm okay, Jessie. It's okay. Let's find Dylan. But Sky moved too slowly. Tony may be down, but Calvin, Pete, and Frankie were back on the ground and followed them. She killed Tony, Pete said. Sky shook her bleary head. If Tony hadn't been chasing them, he wouldn't have been on that mountain to be killed. As good as killed him, anyway, Calvin said. Look at him all gnarled up over there. Tony was a twist of arms and legs. Only a skilled physician would be able to help him now, and the world was short on those. Calvin sauntered after the shuffling woman and boy as if he had all the time in the world. Look what you did, Sky. Do you think we are just going to let you go after that? You just can't learn, can you? What an idiot you are, to think that you can stop us. Us. Agony shot through Sky's battered body with every step she took. She hurt beyond anything she'd ever felt before. A heavy headache began. When she wiped at her face, she brought back a bloodied hand. Sky stared at it for a moment. Still, these men wouldn't leave her alone. A sob escaped Sky before she felt her bracelets roll across the skin of her forearm. Strength. She swallowed the next cry. This had to end. Please go, Jessie. I need you to go. Now. I already told you, I ain't leaving you. There was only one hope left to her, as unlikely as it seemed. Sky turned to face Jesse's father. Her gaze begged the man as she forced him to take some responsibility. Frankie. Frankie refused to look at Sky. Her voice low and gasping, weaker than she would have liked, she pleaded with him. Please, Frankie, save your son. Frankie turned his gaze to the ground. Gathering up whatever might she had left, Sky yelled, Frankie. Yes, Frankie, save your son, Calvin said, imitating Sky. Don't worry, Frankie, I'm going to save him. He pulled his gun from his pocket. I'm tired of this game. It's cost me a nice pair of shoes. With genuine sorrow, Calvin looked down at his scuffed-up dress footwear. Not to mention Tony. She isn't worth that. I wanted more time with her, but I'm ending it now. Calvin raised the gun. Pete, get the boy, and hold him back. Pete lumbered over to Sky and the boy. Jesse clung to Sky as tightly as he could, but one meaty hand to the middle of Sky's chest and one pulling Jesse's arm was all it took to separate them. Jesse fought, beating on Pete, but it was as if a fly buzzed around the large man. He paid no attention to the boy at all. Pete walked a few steps to the left of Sky and stopped, holding the struggling boy. Sky stood as best she could, bleeding from numerous cuts. The anguish from the trauma to her body plain on her face. These were her last moments, and so many thoughts passed through her mind, but one more than any other. Sky turned to Jesse, her gaze filled with concern as the tears cascaded down his face. I love you, Jesse. No matter what happens, remember that, and be a good man. Make sure Dylan knows I love him, that my last thoughts were of him. And Wade, tell Wade I love him too. You're all my family. You're all. Oh, for crying out loud. Calvin said as he pulled the trigger. Frankie launched himself at Calvin a second before the gun fired, knocking the weapon and Calvin's aim off. The bullet didn't hit Calvin's precise target, but it did hit Sky. Sky studied Frankie. He had tried to save her, someone his son loved, and he hated. Frankie had finally become a father to Jesse. She smiled, and he nodded back. A strong, persistent burn grabbed Sky's attention. She raised a hand to it and felt blood running from a wound. Then she slowly sank to the ground. Don't do that again, Frankie. I say who lives and dies. Now come on, she'll be gone soon enough, Calvin said, get your boy and let's go. I'll see if Tony has any life in him. Frankie shook his head. I ain't stayin' with you, Calvin. I'm taking my boy and leavin'. Calvin stared at him for a minute. After everything I've done for you? No. You're just leaving. Calvin raised his gun and shot Frankie in the head. Jesse stilled and started to weep. Pete looked from Calvin to Frankie, then away. An unearthly cry echoed through the forest behind them. Calvin visibly shivered as he turned in time to see the wild men bursting through the trees. Sky's worries eased as Dylan's roar filled the woods. It surrounded her, comforted her. She could finally rest and let the darkness take her. Jesse would be okay.